The U.S. just blockaded Iran. Here's what happens next. Tonight, American warships are enforcing a blockade on Iranian ports. Fighter jets have carried out a fifth straight night of strikes. And the man in the Oval Office is talking, once again, about hitting bridges and power plants next. This didn't start this week. It didn't even start this month. But over the last 10 days, something that had been simmering quietly has exploded back into open warfare. And tonight, we're going to walk through exactly how we got here, what the documents and statements actually say, and where this is very likely headed next. Quick context first, for anyone just catching up. The United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran back in February. That first phase of fighting officially ended in early April, when both sides agreed to a ceasefire. For a few months, an uneasy quiet held. Shipping picked back up. Oil prices came down. It looked, for a while, like the worst of it was over. It wasn't. Here's the timeline of how it fell apart. In early July, Iranian forces struck commercial vessels near the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a huge share of the world's oil has to pass through to reach open water. The U.S. responded within days. On July 7, U.S. Central Command said it had hit more than 80 targets across Iran in a single night, striking air defense systems, radar sites, and dozens of small boats used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. At the same time, Washington reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil sales. Iran didn't back down. It warned it would deliver what it called a crushing response. That response came fast. Within days, Iran's Revolutionary Guard said it had struck U.S. military facilities in Bahrain, hitting aircraft hangars and a drone command center. Jordan's military said it intercepted missiles that entered its airspace from Iranian territory. Explosions were reported across southern Iran, in Bushehr province, which happens to be home to Iran's only civilian nuclear power plant, and on islands that sit directly along the Strait of Hormuz. By July 11, Iran had closed the strait entirely, firing a warning shot at a vessel that tried to use an unauthorized route through the waterway. The U.S. answered with strikes. By July 12, it was a second consecutive night of American attacks, hitting dozens of military targets. Iran responded again, this time targeting U.S. bases in the region. By July 13, the ceasefire that had held since April was, for all practical purposes, dead. President Trump formally notified Congress that renewed military action had begun. Iran said it had struck and disabled 2 tankers it called rogue supertankers. The United Arab Emirates said Iranian missiles hit 2 of its tankers in Omani waters, killing a crew member. Oil prices spiked more than 9% in a single day, the biggest one-day jump for global crude in over 6 years. By July 14, the U.S. had reinstated a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. American forces said they'd already redirected commercial vessels trying to run it. And President Trump, in a television interview, issued a new warning. Unless Iran comes back to the negotiating table, the U.S. will start striking bridges and power plants next. And as of the most recent reporting, we're now on a 5th consecutive night of American strikes, with air defenses activating in Tehran in the early morning hours, and residents reporting explosions that woke them from sleep. Now here's where it gets important to slow down and explain some of this in plain English, because a few of these terms get thrown around without much context. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important oil choke point on Earth. It's a narrow passage between Iran and Oman, and an enormous percentage of the world's seaborne oil has to move through it. Whoever controls access to that strait effectively controls a lever on the global economy. That's why, when Iran closes it, or when the U.S. blockades Iranian ports on the other side of it, oil prices don't just twitch, they spike, hard, almost overnight. A naval blockade means exactly what it sounds like. U.S. warships are physically preventing commercial ships from entering or leaving Iranian ports. That's not a sanction on paper. That's ships in the water, turning other ships around. And the War Powers Resolution, the law that requires a president to notify Congress within 48 hours of starting a new round of military hostilities, matters here because of a dispute buried underneath all of this. The Trump administration's official position has been that hostilities against Iran began back in February and formally ended with the April ceasefire. But by notifying Congress again in mid-July, the administration was effectively acknowledging that this is a new round of fighting, not a continuation of something old. That distinction matters legally, even if politically it barely registers. Here's the part that's easy to miss underneath all the strikes and statements. This war has never stayed contained to just the US and Iran. Jordan has intercepted missiles fired from Iranian territory. Bahrain has sounded sirens and warned residents to shelter after Iranian claims of strikes on a US air base there. Kuwait reported a fire caused by what it called hostile Iranian aerial aggression. Iran has claimed, without independent verification, that it struck US assets at an air base in Jordan, destroying aircraft hangars. Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels have exchanged fresh strikes of their own, effectively ending a separate truce that had nothing directly to do with this fight, but that this fight seems to be dragging back open anyway. This is the pattern with regional conflicts like this one. They rarely stay a two-country story for long. Every ally, every proxy force, every neighboring military gets pulled a little closer to the blast radius. Now, to Iran's side of this, because it matters for understanding why this isn't de-escalating. Iran's foreign ministry has been blunt. There are no plans for negotiations right now. A spokesperson said Iran remains focused on defending the country, and warned that Iran won't honor any agreement if it believes the US has broken its own obligations first. Iran's argument, consistently, has been that the US is the one who broke the April ceasefire, not the other way around. That's a real dispute, not just a talking point. Whoever is right about who broke the ceasefire first shapes the entire narrative of who's escalating and who's defending. And right now, both governments are telling completely different stories about that, with no independent referee in a position to settle it definitively. More evidence of just how serious the economic fallout already is. Gas prices in the US have been climbing steadily. The national average sat at roughly $3.89 a gallon in the most recent reading, up several cents in just the past week alone, as fighting resumed. Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, jumped to its highest level in over a month after the blockade was re-announced. One market analyst put it plainly. Until the situation with the Strait changes, the bias is toward higher oil prices, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and continued swings in the stock market. That's not an abstract economic footnote. That's the price at the pump for every American driver, and it's downstream of decisions being made in a war zone 7,000 miles away. Here's an added wrinkle that complicates the picture even further. Trump initially floated a 20% reimbursement fee on cargo moving through the Strait of Hormuz, essentially a toll the U.S. wanted to charge shipping companies for the American military protecting the route. He's since walked that back, saying it will be replaced instead by Gulf state investment commitments into the U.S. Iran, for its part, hasn't ruled out charging its own toll for anyone crossing the strait, and has threatened ships that pass through without its permission. So on top of the shooting war, there's now a quieter fight over who gets to profit off controlling the world's most important shipping lane. And there's a strange detail buried in all of this too. Unclaimed strikes. Several rounds of attacks on Iran last week landed after the U.S. had already announced it had finished its latest wave of strikes for the night. Nobody has officially claimed responsibility for those additional hits. It's raised open questions, even among people closely tracking this conflict, about who else might be operating in Iranian airspace right now. So where does this go from here? President Trump has said plainly that if Iran doesn't return to the table, next week gets, in his words, really bad, with strikes expanding to bridges and power plants. That would mark a significant shift from military and defense-related targets toward infrastructure that Iranian civilians rely on directly for daily life. Iran's foreign minister has been traveling through the region, including a stop in Doha, though it's unclear whether that trip involves any real effort to restore peace, or is simply diplomatic housekeeping around unrelated ceremonies. Meanwhile, there was one moment of something resembling goodwill in the middle of all this. Iran released an American woman who had been detained since December of 2024, and President Trump publicly thanked Tehran for the gesture. It's a small data point, but it's worth noting. Even active combatants sometimes leave a narrow channel open, whether for leverage, for optics, or for something closer to genuine diplomacy underneath the noise. Here's the bottom line. This is not a contained, two-actor conflict anymore, if it ever really was. It's a war with a broken ceasefire, a blockade choking a critical piece of the global economy, unclaimed strikes nobody will own, and at least 4 other countries now directly pulled into the crossfire. Oil markets are already pricing in more pain. American drivers are already feeling it at the pump. And the next major decision point, whether the US actually follows through on striking Iranian infrastructure like bridges and power plants, could come within days, not weeks. The two governments can't even agree on who broke the ceasefire first. And until that basic disagreement gets resolved, or until one side simply runs out of room to escalate further, there's very little reason to expect this to slow down on its own. We'll keep tracking this as it develops.